Hi everybody, I am Mitzi Red and welcome back into my home studio here for our third installment on this beautiful quilt behind me, Blue Willow. Now, so far we have learned so much over the prior two videos. We have talked about cutting, we have gone over piecing. Let's see, we made blocks, we did sashing, we put rows together, we did so much already. And we're at those final stages, and what you should see right now on your quilt is what's inside the sashing and the blocks itself. Now we're going to look at adding in those final stages. We're going to talk about putting on your borders. We're going to talk about quilting the quilt itself and then doing that binding. So stay with me as we go along, because this is going to take a little bit more of your time to finish up this quilt depending on how you want to do it. But trust me, it is so worth it because you see that final outcome when you have that fully finished quilt. Whether you decide to keep it for yourself, whether you're going to gift it to a friend, whatever you're going to do with it, it's going to be perfect. So let's start out talking first about the borders. So if you look on the quilt behind me, this is the same as what's in your kit. You're going to see we've got the white border and going, of course, all the way around. No, you can't see the bottom. The quilt's big, so it doesn't show all the way to the bottom, but you can see the sides and the top here. Now, if you look at mine, I've already got it fully quilted. Mine's already finished, but I want to go over with you how to do those borders, because that's really going to help you with getting the quilt all finished, squared up, ready to go to move on to the quilting stages. Now, if you look at your directions right there on page 1 where it talks about the cutting directions, you will find that you're going to need 8.5-inch strips or width of fabric in order to put those borders. Now, here's something to think about though. The quilt itself is 76, so 76 this way by 95 long. Well, we know from prior discussions that each strip of fabric is only about 40 to 42, maybe even 44 inches on your width. So you're going to have to piece those borders in order to get them ready to go onto your quilt. And it's a really easy process. You have done so much harder already putting those blocks together than what it's going to be for your borders. So let me show you a little bit on that. Now I've gone ahead and cut 2 strips of my border fabric. Remember guys, this is for that special Texas style one. You got the Blue Willow behind me. But I've gone ahead and cut 2 sets or 2 strips at the 8.5-inch wide. That's where that ruler, when you have a ruler that's like an 8.5 by like a 24-inch ruler, comes in really handy because it's already the correct width for you. Now for the border, when I go ahead and piece those together, it's a very simple process. You're still using your 1/4-inch seam and you're still just putting it together. So I've gone ahead and trimmed off my selvaged edge because we don't need to keep that. We certainly don't want it showing on our border. And I've gone ahead and just got these 2 pieces ready. Now when I put them together, let me grab a couple pins here, whoops, because it is an 8.5-inch wide, and I do want to get a really nice straight on here, so I am going to actually put a couple pins in here. I know that's different than my usual, but I'm just putting what would be the right sides together. That's what I'm going for. So like in your Blue Willow, that's your side that you see the really pretty design on. So I'm going to go ahead and put these together. I'm just going to put a couple pins in here. We really don't need a whole lot in it because it's just more for the support of holding it. And again, it's a 1/4-inch seam on your seam allowance, same as everything else you've done on your quilt. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure my iron is still hot while we're going. And let me just go ahead and drop my presser foot down. I'm going to put that needle in there. Now I am going to go ahead and take a couple back stitch here at the beginning and the end. And here's my reason why. So if somebody grabs your quilt, say they're sleeping underneath it at night, right? There's a good chance they're going to grab the quilt somewhere along the border. Well, anytime you have a seam, obviously that's a weaker point than a solid piece on your fabric. So I do go ahead and give the extra little stitches there on my border to make sure those are held together nice and tight. Okay. So I did back tack on that, or a back stitch, and then it's ready to go. Now let me get my ironing pad here. And we're going to do no different on this than we have done on any of the other as far as the ironing. We're going to iron to one side, or really, I should say press. We're going to press to one side. Again, you guys know I use steam, and so you may hear my iron kicking a little steam as it's heating up here. So I'm going to go ahead and press it to one side. And then I do like to flip it over. Got threads from all the other ones we've done. To clean those off before they go onto the quilt. And I'm just gonna go ahead and give that another little press in there as well. Perfect. Okay, so now I have a pretty long piece, right? And what I'm gonna wanna do is do a measurement on my quilt to make sure. Now, here's how we talk about that. We know that the total quilt finish is a 76 by 95, but again, that's the whole quilt. That's everything finished with it. And if you look on your directions for cutting your border fabric, we're looking at a 79.5 inch on length for 2 cuts, and then the other one is a 76.5. And the reason for that is because the 76.5, we're looking at the shorter, the shorter's on the side, the shorter one going down. So you want to make sure though, your measurements are where you need them to be. Now, once you take a look, if you go back to your directions, and you can even look at the uncolored page, and you see it shows to do the side borders first. So here's what you ought to do, because my piecing might look a little bit different than your piecing. Hopefully it doesn't. We're all learning that 1/4 inch seam, so we're doing really good with it. But you want to go ahead and measure your quilt in multiple places before you cut your borders. And here's why. So if I measure it here on this side, maybe I have that 76.5 and it's perfect. So I cut, right? But what if I measure on this side and I'm 76 3/4? If I've already cut my fabric for my border, then I'm gonna end up short. And we wanna save you from that. So before you cut your border fabric, stitch it all together, it's totally fine. But before you cut, measure that border to make sure you get the right cut. And let me tell you why it can be a little off. For one, let's say on your 1/4 inch seams, you might have got a little bit off on them in a couple of spots. It can actually really start to add up and also subtract on how long or how short that border is. So be sure to take those measurements, measure twice, cut once, and make sure that you've got it right. So I'm going to take a moment here. I'm going to get my quilt out and let you put those borders on. I want you to do the side borders first. Now, when you go to your top borders, again, we're piecing it the exact same way, but do those measurements again. Measure from at the very top from side to make sure you've got the right length on your borders. Same thing on your bottom border, you want to make sure. So how's the process go again? Side borders, and then top, and then bottom go on. And when we come back, we're going to talk about going over with quilting. So I'm going to get my quilt out because I've already got it quilted for you. And we'll take a look at that. We'll see you in just a minute. Welcome back again. Now, as you see, I have my quilt laid out in front of me. I've got my blue willow behind me. And of course, this is the Texas quilt that I did as we've gone along through these lessons. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that mine is already quilted, and it's for a good reason. I wanted to be sure that I could show you what it looks like after the quilting stage takes place. So here's where we're at in the lessons. You've put together your whole quilt, you should have all your borders around, and you are ready to get to the final stage, which is the binding. Right there, that blue binding in your blue willow quilt that goes all the way around. But in order to get to that last stage, doing the binding, you do need to go ahead and quilt the actual quilt. So you'll often hear it referred to as a quilt sandwich, and it's 3 layers that go together to make that quilt. You obviously have your top, you have the batting, which goes in between, and you have your backing. Let's talk a little bit about batting first. Now, there are multiple brands, multiple styles, multiple fibers that are used for your batting. It can be anywhere from a cotton, a polyester, bamboo, wool, all kinds of things are used in order to make batting. And that batting is going to really determine as far as how cool or how warm this quilt can be. Now, on this particular quilt itself, I've used just 100% cotton on my batting. It's kind of my preference. You know, I've got some quilts that if it's going to be like a winter quilt, I might use a wool instead. But majority of my quilts are all going to be done with a cotton batting. Now, they do come in different shades. You can get a natural batting, so it's unbleached on your fibers, and that's actually what I've used here on this one. Now, that's perfectly fine for this quilt because again, I've got a gray as my very lightest color, And so that unbleached color is not going to show through. But when I look at my white one back here, I went with a bleached batting because I want it to be really nice, really crisp white. I don't want that tan color kind of showing through. So keep that in mind. They even make them in all shades. I mean, you can get black batting now when you're working with really darks. And if you're working with like a black background, put that black batting in there so that way, you know, your lighter color fibers don't show through. So let's talk about layering those together to make your quilt sandwich. So I mentioned it's the top, the batting, and the backing. Now, depending upon how you want to finish your quilt, can also vary as far as how much you need in your batting and your backing. The pattern itself calls for 5 3/4 yards of your backing fabric. And it'll work perfectly fine if you're going to be doing it on your own machine. Check though, if you're going to send your quilt off to have it professionally long-armed, check with your long armor to see if they want you to have any extra on that backing fabric. Because in order for them to put it up on their long arm frame, they may need a little extra fabric and the batting in order to do that for you. So just verify with them what their preference is so they can give you the best quality product back in return. Now mine itself that I've got here in front of me, I actually did do this on my long arm, and I just did an all over meandering style stitch. Just something easy, something quick, but it still took like about 4 hours to do. I'm a fast quilter, remember, so I do drive it at top speed. If you're doing it on your home sewing machine, just be aware it's going to probably take you a little bit longer. Some tips and tricks to go by: certainly have a large table to be able to spread your quilt out on, because you're going to want to make sure you've got something to help hold that up. Also, if you're going to be doing it on your home machine, be sure you are looking at basting your quilt. And what does that mean? Well, it's a way for those 3 layers to hold together. So whether you pin baste it, where you put like, you know, pins it to hold it together. I use oftentimes, if I've got enough space to do it, I'll just spray baste my quilts. There's a lot of temporary basting sprays out there that you can find, and that'll help hold my layers together also. Now, there are tons of options out there for you to think about as far as how you want to finish your quilt, whether you do it on your own machine or take it to the long arm. And you can do all over, like an all over, you know, kind of free motion, a meandering design like I did here on mine. And if you look on the quilt behind me, if you can see it a little bit, I even did ruler work on this, and that's a really fun technique to learn as you go also. That's also part of being with free motion quilting. So there's a lot of options out there. I highly recommend you explore them and find what's going to work best for you. But you need to get all 3 layers quilted before we go to the final stages of putting the binding on. So once you have all the layers quilted, the last thing to do is going to be for us to bind your quilt. And by doing that, we cover up those raw edges. You certainly don't want to leave the raw edges behind. Now, a quick note I should provide you on when it comes to actually doing your quilting. The batting you choose can determine a lot as far as what kind of quilting design or motif you're going to put into your quilt. On every bag, it does have on there as far as how much space you can allow between your stitches. And that can vary depending on the fiber content of your batting. So do check that, because some you might can do 8 to even 10 inches in between your stitches. Some it might only be 2 to 4. So look at your content on the package, see what it allows for your stitching. If it doesn't come in a bag, if you're buying it by the yardage, just find out in the directions that come with the yardage as far as what is your length and your width you can provide between the stitches. You want to make sure you get it right, because the last thing you want to do is when you wash your quilt, to have it start to come apart on the inside. So I'm going to tuck this quilt away. When I come back, I'll have my machine back out. I'm going to go over those final steps with binding, and we are going to finish our quilt and have it ready to go. All right, so see you back here in just a moment. All right, welcome back again. We are just down the wire, getting towards the end of it. And what we're ready to do is to start putting our binding together. Now, if you look at your directions again, you will see that these are cut in a 2.5 inch strip by your width of fabric. And that's pretty much the most common size for binding that you're going to go with. Now, there are options out there with doing prepackaged bindings, but I'll dissuade you from that. I recommend you doing your own. because it matches the quilt and it coordinates. Now, with the Blue Willow quilt, obviously you're using the same dark blue that's going to be your sashings, and I'm doing the exact same with my, as I call it, my Texas sky, my gray with my white stars is what I want to call it, that I use on my sashing as well, and that's going to be my binding. It really helps to finish off the quilt and pull those colors all the way out to your edges. Now, you'll see a pile of strips here. I've gone ahead and got started on my binding piece because I want to be able to show you how to go and how to take your quilt through that binding stage, because it can be a little confusing on how do you connect those two ends up, you know, at that quilt where you start and you finish, so you have a nice clean finish all the way through and you can't really tell where your start and your stop is. So one thing I want to talk about first is putting your binding strips together. Now you've got 9 strips at that 2.5 inch, and how do we put it together? How do we make this big piece? You could certainly put it together the exact same way you did your borders, where you just put those 2 pieces directly together, one straight, you know, across, and do that quarter seam. But I'm going to dissuade you a little bit from that, and here's why. If you do that on your binding, you get a lot of bulk where you're folding it over. Now, here's something to think about. We have a 2.5 inch strip, and you see how small it ends up being? Well, it's because when we're going to take that, and after I get it all pieced together, all my strips together, we're going to fold it in half and then stitch it on, and then it rolls over to close that up. Don't worry, I'll go over that in just a second. But in order to reduce some of the bulk that you're going to have on those edges, to make it a nice clean finish and easier for you to finish, whether you choose to finish by machine or by hand, you actually want to put it on a diagonal. And it also works really well because if you have a print fabric you're using, then it helps to kind of seamlessly incorporate, maybe it's a stripe or a design together. You don't notice as much break as far as with the design itself. So you may be able to see here I've got it on the angle, right? And I've got these nice little triangles hanging out behind me. And I'm going to show you exactly how we do that. So I've got my flat piece. Now this is all these, what do we got? 8 of them here already. They're put together on my final piece, and I've got it laid out right here. Again, you're always putting these together with the right sides together. So keep that in mind. I'm going to open up my final strip here. So my 2.5 by 42-ish. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lay this across. Now you see here I've got one going this way, one going that way, right sides together. Until you're comfortable with getting that diagonal stitched, feel free to grab a pen if you want, and I'm going to put it right here up at this corner because I need it out of my stitch way. So I've got it here together. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stitch from this corner on the top here down to the corner on the bottom. Now, if you're not sure where your line's at, grab you a marking pen or pencil, draw your line off on that diagonal. Kind of think of it the same way as when we did our half square triangles up here. You're kind of doing the exact same thing. But then we're going to toss off and cut off a little bit of it. So this, when I'm stitching down, I'm taking the center of my foot or my needle and I'm stitching straight down that diagonal. So let me go ahead and do that. Now I've done these enough that I can literally just put my finger on the edge on the bottom part of it, so I know exactly where I need my stitching to come to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm just going to go straight all the way down until I've got it. Let me cut my threads. Let me take it out, take my pin out, and you see I've got them all together just like this. When I open it up though, I've got a nice strip. My seam now is on that diagonal, so it's going to help reduce the bulk. Whereas if I had just a straight one, when I fold it over, I've got a lot of layers I'm having to force together. Whereas by putting it on the diagonal, it's taking that bulk down. So from here, grab your trusty pair of scissors, because we do use scissors in quilting too, not just rotary cutters. I am leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am cutting off that extra triangle piece. We don't need it. So now I've just got that nice clean, what would be like the 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to do that on all of them. Be super careful not to cut into your fabric you just stitched together. You don't want to make a mess of the work you just put through. I'm going to trim that down. and my iron is still hot because the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to press these, because just like how when we were doing the quilting and we wanted to make sure that our seams were pointing in the same direction when we press them, I want to do the same thing here on my binding. I don't want to have that loose and that bulk in the way. I want to make sure it is really nice and really clean, because the less bulk I can have to fight with, the better off I'm going to be when it comes time to put this on and to bind this quilt. Now, as we're getting through here, again, there's a couple ways to do your binding. I always machine bind it first, you know, that way I can get a nice secure on there. And then if I'm going to final machine bind, or if I'm going to hand bind it, really depends on what I'm going to do with this quilt. If it's a pretty special, pretty unique piece or kind of a show piece, when I turn it under at the end, I often will go ahead and hand stitch it down. But if it's a standard quilt that's going to go on the kid's bed or somewhere, you know, that's going to be very heavily used, I actually prefer to go ahead and machine stitch it down. It's your personal preference. Now, to finish this, you're going to want to go ahead, and I just like to give all of it a nice little flat press down. And I'm going to press those to one side. I'm going to give it a little bit of steam there. And then I'm going to flip it over and do the same. Okay. Now, I'm going to do that the whole length of my binding. And we're going to pretend like I've already done that. I'll do it here in just a minute. But I want to show you what's next, so that when we come back in just a moment, I've already got it ready to go for you. So I've got a 2.5 inch strip piece. I'm going to fold it over. Now this is wrong sides together. You want to see your pretty side, right? I'm going to fold it over in half. Move this away from the machine for a second. Just like that. And I'm going to press that down to give me a nice fold. I do obviously recommend your iron be really nice and hot for this. You can use starch if you want to. Like if your fabric is really super soft and it's just not wanting to stay in place, certainly you can put some starch into it, because I really want my binding to be really good and firm. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so we put all the pieces together. We are going to come in and trim down to our seam allowance, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to press it to make sure it's a nice smooth finish all the way through. And then after you do that, you're going to fold it in half and press it again. So now you've basically got 1 1/4. The next thing I'm going to do once it's all done, I'm just going to roll it up, because it's going to be the easiest way to handle it when it comes down. So you're just going to start rolling it up to where you come in a nice, it's going to make a pretty good size ball of binding there, or roll of binding. So I want you to do that first. I'm going to take the rest of mine over to the iron. I'm going to get it all pressed and ready to go. And next up, I'm going to show you exactly how to put it onto your quilt. So hang tight, when we'll be right back with that. Okay, so by now you should have your binding together. Remember I mentioned it makes a nice big roll? It really does. Let me give you some tips and tricks on this as well, something to think about. So this can get out of hand and can take off on you. I have had these rolls take off across the floor, and next thing I know, I've got like yards and yards and yards of binding just hanging out across the room. So I always try to find a way, what's my best way to hold on to it so it's not in my way, but it's also there close by. So here's some ideas. Now I have the base, this is just the base part of a thread cone stand. The other part that holds the thread is in the other room. But they basically just hold your bigger cones on there. Now I can hold big cones on the back of my machine, but not every machine can handle a setup like this. So these are perfect for more than one thing besides just holding this cone. Also, whoops, if I take the cone off, this base is cast iron. It's very heavy duty. I still have the pin. I can come in and slide the center right onto it. Oh well, I can take it off from the top and go. I might have wound it up a little too tight. And then I can push that right back onto my base. And now it holds my binding. So as I'm pulling it, it's just rolling it off like ribbon. Okay, and so this is a great option to have. You could put it in a jar if you've got a big enough jar that it can feed through. I've seen it wrapped around like a soup can, you know, something that's kind of heavy duty and sturdy to where it's not just gonna go rolling off and flying throughout the room. So I like this option a lot because I can sit it right in front of my machine and it's just gonna feed off with me as I need it to go. So now we're gonna get ready to go ahead and put the binding actually on the quilt. And there's a process for starting this. You don't want to start right at the end of your binding. You actually want to give it a pretty good tail, loose tail to start with. You can start on any side of your quilt. It doesn't matter. Top, bottom, side to side, it doesn't matter. Just pick your spot. Now what I do prefer to do is start in the middle of that side. And it gives me room when I work to come around and to put those two binding tails together. And we'll get there. So for me, I've gone ahead and laid my quilt back out. I just got it loosely put up here because I want to make sure it's easy to work and go around with. And I'm going to roughly find my center. And I'm going to go ahead and take some thread tail or some binding tail here. Okay. Now I would take probably a good 12 inches or more on average is what I do, and just leave it out there. Now you may think, why in the world are we doing that? You'll see when we get to connect these tails, okay? I am taking the raw edges of my binding and laying it on top of the raw edges of my quilt. Again, I don't pin, I do this as I go around. You may see some that do and don't pin, and that's fine. I'm gonna bring it under my machine. And again, this is where you have the advantage of having a table to help support your quilt. I've got a lot of quilt here, so I don't want to be fighting it too much. I'm still using my 1/4 inch seam. That's not changing. We're sticking with that the whole way through. And this one, I'm going to go ahead and take those reverse stitches or those back stitches in there to go ahead and lock that binding down. I want to make sure it is definitely going to stay in place. So I'm going to drop my needle in, take a few stitches through, and I'm going to back tack, and then I'm going to start coming through. Now I'm going to stitch this all the way down to my corner, and I'm going to show you at a different angle from above how to make those corners work, because you want a nice clean mitered, put it on the diagonal corner, and I'm going to take you through that. It may seem tricky at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's really not. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this all the way down to the very end, and then I'm going to show you exactly how to make that nice mitered corner for your binding. All right, so now I'm going to take you in on how to finish this off as we come to our corners. Now I've already put the stitch in there, but I'm still going to walk you through it. It's not going to hurt me to put an extra set of stitches in. So I've gone ahead, I'm going to drop my needle back into place. Again, I'm staying with my 1/4 inch seam all the way down. So let me just go ahead and stitch that back down. Okay, so I'm going to take that all the way back down. I'm just going right back over what I did, no problem there. And I'm going to come here to my corner. Now I'm going to stop when I'm about a 1/4 inch out from that edge is where I want to go ahead and stop at. I'm going to lift my foot up and I am going to rotate my quilt to where that corner, where the sides all meet, is facing towards me. Now my foot has a nice big opening in the center, so it makes it a little bit easier for me to get to. And then I'm going to actually stitch all the way down, put it in reverse. I'm going to stitch all the way back, leaving my needle in the down position is what I'm doing. So I make a nice little corner. I'm going to go ahead and cut. Oh, and that one got caught. No big deal. That's why we keep scissors close by. And so what it gives me is I'm coming straight down and I'm taking that turn right there. So I'm coming straight down, I'm taking that at a 45 and I'm making this little corner piece here. Now here's how we turn our binding in order to get those nice mitered corners we all want. So I'm just going to push my quilt out of the way. You got to keep it close by. You don't want it to pull off and out of your way. So I've got it all bundled up over here. I'm now going to take my binding, the rest of my binding tail, and I'm going to fold it over on that 45. So, and I'm just gonna give it a little hand press. You don't need to bring out your iron for this, just a little hand press is fine. But you can see then it gives me that kind of 45-degree angle in there. Next, I'm just gonna hold that in place with the one finger, and I'm gonna lay this back over the top. And what you'll end up with is it makes a really nice square coming on with the sides and the edges of your quilt. So see how easily that came across? Next up, I'm gonna slide it, keeping hold of it. I'm gonna slide it right here under my needle and my foot again. Should pull my threads out of the way. I'm gonna drop my foot down, make sure I'm lined up. And I wanna make sure when I put my needle in that I at least get a little bit of the foot on that. So keep in mind, it's quite a few layers of your quilt plus your binding. So you wanna make sure that your foot is resting comfortably up there. I'm gonna go ahead and take a few stitches. Just take your time and slow. I'm gonna reverse that as well. I really wanna get a good lock on my stitches right there on those corners. Those corners take a lot of tugging, so we wanna make sure that they are well taken care of. All right, let me get my quilt here so I can continue on straight down this side. And then we're gonna connect these binding strips, because remember when we started off, we had it to where, I left about a good 12 plus inches out. And I want to show you why I do that and why it's important when we put this binding together. So let me move my quilt around a little bit here. And I'm going to take a few more stitches and I'm going to lock in that. And I know it's not connected yet. I'm just trying to get an idea how close I am to it. So let me take a few more. I'm just going to go ahead and reverse and lock that down and cut. Now, here's what can be the tricky part. So if you remember, when we originally put the quilt together, right, I was trying to avoid, when I was doing my binding strips, having a straight up and down. I wanted at the diagonal, and the reason for that was to reduce the bulk. Now, when you connect these strips together, yes, if you're having a hard time getting that diagonal, you can certainly do a straight piecing. But again, I like to go ahead and make the diagonal in order to get a much cleaner finishing on that. Okay, so let me get this out here so you guys can see it pretty good. I'll just slide it here under my machine. So this is my original tail I started with, okay? And it's back here a little bit, and I'm just gonna lay it straight out. I am going to very easily just keep my current tail, my current length of binding I've been working through. And I'm going to just slide it here to where it is straight and flat. And I'm gonna lay it directly on top of where I started. My start piece is underneath, it's this one, and this is my end piece. Now, what I'm looking for is right here is where my start piece, the beginning of it was. And here's how I'm going to attach these. I've got any ruler is perfectly fine to use this for. Now, here's the trick to this. My original piece, when I cut my binding strips, was 2.5 inch wide. So what I want to do in order to match these, I'm going to come in and I'm going to come to the 2.5 inch point for my piece that's going to lay over. Okay, so here's where my beginning piece started. I'm coming to 2.5. Okay, so I would want to cut right there on the 2.5 of my top piece, not my bottom, only the top. I have personally found that I do a little bit better with making sure that it's nice and tight. If I should go at about the 2 3/8 mark is where I normally cut. So just a little bit shorter than where I was at. So I'm gonna come in here and just come slightly shorter. Now again, I'm cutting my end piece, not my top piece. I'm just gonna make a quick little straight cut there. And this was the last of my binding, is now done, gone out of the way. Okay. Here's where it gets a little tricky for you. And let me tell you, if you don't get the first time, no big deal. If you don't get the 10th time, no big deal. Keep trying. You'd be surprised how many times I put binding together and I go, well, that didn't go together right, and I have to redo it. Take your end piece. Take your bottom piece. Let me see if I can get us in here in a good angle to see this. I'm going to open them up so they are right sides together. Taking my end, I'm going to lay it on top of my beginner piece. And I'm just going to, on that diagonal, remember how I did the other ones on diagonal? Same thing. I'm going to take a pin this time, and I'm going to put it down here in this corner. I just want to help hold it together. Now this is the reason I left so much extra length, because I'm going to come in here, I'm going to push my quilt out of the way, but I've got to be able to get this part under my machine. If I didn't leave a bunch of extra space on my binding, it would be really hard to get this under my machine. So I'm going to open that up, make sure it's all nice and super flat. I know my corner piece is right up here. I'm just going to pull my quilt in and out of the way. Again, this gets a little tricky. I'm going to drop my foot down. I want it on the corner to where I have a nice straight diagonal from my foot all the way down. Let me just grab my thread tail there to make sure it stays tucked under. Don't want to lose my thread right now. Okay. I'm going to stitch on that diagonal, just like how when we connected the first sets together. Same thing. Just make sure your fabric is not twisting and flipping underneath there. I'm stitching down. I just come right off the edge. I'm going to cut. Okay. I'm going to pull my pin. Now watch what happens. That just came together. Oh, I lost it here for you. That just came together as one piece. See my extra? Just like how we did at the beginning, I'm now one piece. So I'm going to come in and grab my scissors, trim my excess binding off, excess threads too, fold it over, and I'm going to go ahead and start back where I stopped earlier. I'm going to stitch it all the way back down, and it will completely close my binding. So I'm going to do that now. And when we come back, I'm going to talk to you about how to turn it over and make sure you've secured your binding. So go ahead and finish stitching it all the way around to where it becomes then one full piece. Okay, so did you get your binding on? You should have it on there now, but you do have these raw edges. So to truly finish this quilt, we've got to finish that binding. And I'm here to show you exactly how to take care of that and get those nice miter corners we're all looking for. So one of the favorite items I use are the little clips. They're like a little binding clip, or I mean, I use them for everything from doing my binding to, you know, projects like with leather and stuff you can't put a pin through. These work out perfect. So they come in multiple sizes, multiple colors. I mean, they're everywhere. So you can definitely get some at Stitchin Heaven and to get this. And I find they are the easiest way to hold my binding in place. You can use pins. That's fine if you don't have them, but you'll definitely, once you use these for binding, you will never want to try anything else. So I'm going to show you here, and I've got a couple in place just to show you how the corners look as you're putting it down. But don't worry, I'm going to take these off and I'm going to show you exactly what I do. So I like to start actually at a corner when I'm getting ready to do this. And you see how I've got my corner just like I showed you previously with the square. So I'm going to take it and I'm just going to flip it over. And the part that's on the bottom of that corner, I'm going to lay that over first. Just give it a nice little hole down, and I'm going to slip a clip on there, just like that. Then I'm going to take the top part of my corner, flip it over, put another clip on, again, just like that. The back you will see, and you might have to wiggle a little bit to get it really nice and even and adjust it, but it'll start giving you that miter corner on the back just like it does on your front. And then again, I just go down the rest of the way on the row and put my clips in. I put my clips in on one whole side first before I even start stitching. Now, once I've got my whole row of clips on, you can see that it gives you what looks more like what we're shooting for your finished, right? But we still need to stitch it down. So here's your options. You can hand stitch it. So if you want to do it by hand, thread and needle, go ahead. Again, I'll do that if it's something special. If it's a unique quilt. You know, I'm gifting this to someone. I'll put the extra time into doing the hand stitching because I'm going to go right along that edge and bury it, and you're never going to see that it's on there. It's a nice clean finish. But honestly, the majority of the quilts in my house are all used. They're on beds, they're on couches. I mean, they get used as they should. So on those, I want to make sure my binding is really nice and really strong. So I'm going to machine stitch it. And you can do a couple different options. If your machine has decorative stitching available for it, absolutely go with those decorative stitches. They look really neat on there. You can follow along just on the line there. So kind of like a stitch in the ditch right along the line of where your binding connects to your quilt. You could do a straight stitch in there. You could do a decorative across it. There's a lot of options out there for you. But that'll get you finished on your quilt. Do that all the way around. Trim your threads is the last thing I would recommend you do. Trim on the top, trim on the back, trim those binding, get rid of all those little extra thread tails. It takes a little bit of time to do it, but that extra step definitely makes it worthwhile. Once you've done that, you have a finished quilt. You made Blue Willow. You finished it all yourself, and you should be absolutely proud and thrilled that you've got the quilt done. It is a beautiful quilt. No matter how you finished it, no matter which arrangement you put your blocks in, you did it, and that's what's the most important of it all. I hope that you've had a lot of fun joining me here in my studio. I really feel blessed that you've come in and joined me and hung out and we had fun. We went through the quilt. I hope that you'll come back again another time for more. Think of this as just the beginning of your quilting journey. I hope this has inspired you and made you want to go ahead and get the next kit and the next quilt and start going more. Of course, at any time, if you need help or you have questions, the amazing staff there at Stitchin Heaven is right there and ready to take care of you with anything you need. Again, I am Mitzi Red, and I thank you so much for coming in and spending your time in the studio with me, and I do hope that I get to see you again. Thanks again.